Under the dim glow of a Jersey diner's neon sign, Willie Moretti sat in his usual corner booth, the kind of man who could make a whole room feel like it owed him a favor. He wasn't the biggest name in the underworld, not the loudest or the flashiest, but he had that quiet pull, the kind that made people lean in when he talked, the kind that made you nervous if he smiled too easily. The jukebox hummed in the background, playing Sinatra. Of course it was Sinatra. Around here, everyone knew Frankie was Willie's guy. It was one of those open secrets the world whispered about but never really questioned. Willie had helped him in the early days, nudged the right people, loosened the right hands, and made sure that golden voice was heard where it needed to be. Some said Sinatra owed his career to Moretti. Others said it was friendship. Willie just smiled when asked. "The kid's got talent," he'd say, lighting a cigarette. "Talent deserves a little help." But behind that easy grin and tailored suit, Willie Moretti was a man living in two worlds, half in the shadows of the mob, half in the bright lights of show business. He was a bridge between gangsters and gentlemen, a man who could talk to a movie producer one minute and a bookmaker the next, without missing a beat. He carried himself with charm, but it was the kind that could turn cold fast if you crossed him. It was 1949, and things were changing fast. The old ways of the mob were fading, replaced by younger, hungrier men with less patience and less loyalty. The rules that once bound everyone together, respect, silence, honor, were cracking. Willie could feel it every time he walked into a meeting. There was more talk, less listening, more greed, less loyalty, and worst of all, more eyes watching from places they shouldn't. That night at the diner, a young man slid into the booth across from him, nervous, sweating, trying too hard to look calm. Willie didn't even glance up from his coffee. "You're late," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The kid stammered something about traffic. Willie smiled thinly. "Don't lie to me, kid. Traffic doesn't make you sweat like that. You're scared, and that's okay. You should be." The kid's name was Joey, and he had messed up a numbers run, one that had cost Willie's crew a good chunk of change. Normally, that kind of mistake didn't go unpunished. But Willie wasn't just a boss, he was a teacher. "Tell me what you learned," he said, leaning back. Joey swallowed hard, his voice shaking as he explained what went wrong. Willie listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When the kid finished, Willie nodded. "Good," he said finally. "Now fix it, and don't let it happen again." He waved his hand, dismissing Joey, who left looking like he'd just been handed his life back. One of the waitresses approached, smiling nervously. "You're too kind to these boys," she said. Willie chuckled softly. "If I scare 'em too much, they stop thinking. Fear's useful, but too much of it and they stop learning." That was Willie Moretti in a nutshell. He believed in discipline, but not cruelty. He believed in respect, not terror. And it made him different from the others. The bosses up north, the ones who ran the big cities, they saw kindness as weakness. But Willie saw it as strategy. If people liked you, they worked harder. If they feared you, they worked only until they found someone scarier. Still, even a man like Willie couldn't escape the tightening noose of the modern world. The newspapers were full of stories about the mob now. The Senate was starting to ask questions. Names were getting thrown around. The FBI was listening to everything. And in the middle of all that noise, a rumor began to spread, one that made Willie's stomach turn. They said he was talking. He laughed it off at first. Me? Talk? To who? But rumors had a way of growing legs. He started noticing how people looked at him differently. Old friends avoided his calls. His seat, at certain tables, started to vanish. The whispers grew louder, and soon even the men he'd mentored were keeping their distance. Frank Sinatra called him one night, his voice low, worried. "Willie, they're saying things about you, crazy things. You know I don't believe it, but maybe lay low for a while." Willie sighed. "Frankie, you can't hide from smoke when you're standing in the fire. You just gotta hope the truth burns brighter." But deep down, Willie knew something was changing. something he couldn't stop. He'd always prided himself on being one step ahead, on reading a room before anyone else knew what was happening. But now the rooms were changing, the faces were changing, and even the rules were changing. He'd been part of building the foundation, but the house standing on it now didn't look like anything he recognized. One afternoon, he met with an old associate, a man named Tommy Lucchese, a name that carried weight. They sat in the back of a quiet restaurant, away from curious ears. Tommy leaned in, his voice a low growl. "Willie, people are nervous. You're getting noticed. Maybe too much." Willie smirked. "Since when did attention scare us?" "It's not the attention, Willie," Tommy said. "It's the kind of attention. These Senate hearings, they're bad for business. You've always had a big mouth, but now they're saying maybe it's too big." Willie's expression hardened just for a second. "You know me better than that, Tom." Tommy nodded slowly. "I do, but I'm not the one you gotta convince." When Tommy left, Willie sat there for a long time, stirring his coffee that had gone cold. He thought about the old days, before the suits, before the deals, before the world turned everything into headlines and secrets into gossip. He had played the game the right way, honest in his dishonesty, loyal in his own code, but now it didn't seem to matter. That night, as he drove home through the quiet Jersey streets, Sinatra played again on the radio. "I did it my way." Willie laughed softly. "Yeah, kid," he said under his breath. "You and me both." He didn't know it yet, but the walls were already closing in, and somewhere, in the dark corners of a backroom meeting, his name had already been spoken, quietly, coldly, as part of a decision he would never hear coming. That was how it always went in his world. When loyalty started to crumble, even the kindest men eventually faced the silence that followed. And Willie Moretti, the man who helped build both stars and syndicates, was about to find out how heavy silence could really be. The morning after that uneasy meeting with Tommy Lucchese, Willie Moretti woke to the faint sound of birds outside his Jersey home. The world looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of calm that feels like a warning rather than comfort. He sat at his kitchen table, coffee steaming beside an open newspaper filled with more talk about organized crime and the Senate hearings. Headlines named names, hinted at power, corruption, and scandal. Everything the underworld worked so hard to keep buried. Willie sipped his coffee, scanning the article. He saw his own name mentioned halfway down. A short line, a passing mention, but enough to make his pulse quicken. Willie Moretti, known associate of Frank Costello and others suspected of ties to gambling operations in New Jersey and New York. He chuckled bitterly. They always said suspected, but the word might as well have been confirmed. The truth didn't matter anymore. Once the newspapers painted your picture, the world filled in the rest with their imagination. He folded the paper and stared out the window, lost in thought. He had come up in an era when power was quiet, when a man's reputation was earned in whispers, not shouted in headlines. But that world was slipping away. The new breed of mobsters, ambitious, reckless, untamed, didn't understand discretion. They wanted to be seen, admired, feared. They didn't get that the secret was the power. By late morning, a black sedan rolled into his driveway. Willie didn't need to look to know who it was. Tony, the Hat, Lanza. One of his oldest associates, a man who'd been with him since the days of small-time numbers in Newark. Tony stepped out, looking tense, lighting a cigarette even before the car door closed. "Morning, Willie," Tony said, forcing a grin. "Morning. You look like you've seen a ghost," Willie replied. Tony hesitated before sitting down across from him. "You're not gonna like what I gotta tell you." Willie leaned back, calm but alert. "Try me." Tony lowered his voice. "They're talking about you at the top, Willie. Real talk. The bosses, they're getting nervous. They think maybe the stress is getting to you. They're saying, maybe you're not all there lately." Willie froze for a second. Then he laughed. "Not all there? What's that supposed to mean?" Because I tell jokes now? Because I like to talk? I've been talking my whole damn life, Tony. It's part of the charm. Tony didn't laugh. His silence said more than words could. Willie sighed, the humor draining from his eyes. They think I'm a risk. Tony nodded. There's word going around about your health, about you talking too much, about you maybe being unpredictable. That word, unpredictable, hit harder than any threat. In their world, it didn't mean unstable. It meant uncontrollable. And an uncontrollable man was a dangerous man. Willie rubbed his temples. He'd known this moment might come. His mind wasn't what it used to be. The headaches, the confusion, they came and went. Little flashes that made him forget names or lose his train of thought mid-sentence. He tried to hide it, to laugh it off. But people noticed. In a world where silence was sacred, a man who spoke too freely, even accidentally, could destroy everything. Tony leaned forward. Look, Willie, I told them they were crazy. I said you'd never turn on anyone, but you know how it is. Once people start whispering, it don't stop. Willie's jaw tightened. You believe them, Tony? Tony looked down. Doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what they do. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sound was the slow ticking of the wall clock, each second heavier than the last. Finally, Willie stood, walked to the counter and poured them both another cup of coffee. You remember when we started, Tony? He said softly. We were nobodies, running slips, hiding cash under floorboards, praying the cops didn't notice. And now they're all scared of me, because I talk too much? He chuckled darkly. That's the joke of the century. Tony's voice cracked slightly. Maybe it's time to lay low, Willie. Just for a while. Let things cool off. Willie shook his head. You can't hide from smoke when the fire's already in the house. That afternoon, he drove to New York to see Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, calm, intelligent, diplomatic. Costello had always been one of the few men Willie respected. If anyone could stop the tide turning against him, it was Frank. They met in a quiet Manhattan apartment. Costello was seated in a leather chair, smoking and listening to the radio softly. He looked older than Willie remembered, tired, worn by years of pressure and politics. Willie, he said with a faint smile, you look good. Sit down. Willie smiled faintly. You always were a bad liar, Frank. Costello chuckled, then sighed. You know why you're here. Because everyone thinks I've lost my mind, Willie said bluntly. Not everyone, Costello replied carefully. But some people are worried. You've been talking more, joking in the wrong places, laughing at the wrong things. The commission doesn't like attention, and lately you've been front-page news. Willie spread his hands. So what do they want me to do? Stop being me? Costello didn't answer. The silence said it all. For the first time, Willie saw it clearly, the distance between himself and the men he once called friends. The machine he'd helped build had no room for weakness, no room for sentiment, and certainly no room for men who made people nervous. He stood, walking to the window. You know, Frank, I always thought we were different, smarter than the old school guys. We built something that was supposed to last. But you know what I realized? He turned, eyes sharp. We just built a prettier cage. Costello didn't respond. He didn't need to. Willie knew the man was powerless to stop what was coming. As Willie left that night, rain started to fall, soft, steady, relentless. He walked slowly to his car, hat pulled low. For a man who'd spent decades surrounded by power, influence, and loyalty, it was the first time he truly felt alone. On the drive home, his headlights cut through the darkness. Sinatra's voice came on again, that same song that had followed him like a shadow. My Way. Willie laughed bitterly, tapping the steering wheel. Guess we both did it our way, huh, Frankie? But this time, His laugh didn't sound like pride, it sounded like goodbye. He didn't know it yet, but every step he took from that moment on would lead him closer to a truth no one could avoid in his world. That loyalty had an expiration date, and his was fast approaching. By the time autumn rolled around in 1951, Willie Moretti's world had started to shrink. The same men who used to toast his name now whispered when he entered a room. His phone calls went unanswered, his invitations ignored, and his laughter, once the loudest sound in any restaurant, now drew uneasy glances. He could feel it in the air. Something was shifting. The warmth was gone. The handshakes felt colder, rehearsed. Even the streets he'd grown up walking seemed to watch him now, holding their breath, waiting for the end of a story they already knew. One night he was sitting in a booth at a small diner off Route 46, the kind of place he used to love, where the coffee was burnt and the waitress knew your name. He was alone, stirring sugar into his cup, when a voice broke through the hum of the jukebox. "Willie, you look like you're carrying the world on your back." He turned to see Johnny Fingers Calabrese sliding into the booth across from him. Johnny was one of the few who still came around, loyal but nervous. Willie could see it in his twitching hands, the way his eyes darted toward the door. "I used to carry the world," Willie said, smirking faintly. "Now I'm lucky if I can carry a conversation." Johnny chuckled, but his eyes didn't match the sound. He leaned in. "Word is the commission's meeting again soon. Your name's gonna come up." Willie sighed. "What else is new?" "This time's different," Johnny said quietly. "They're talking serious, Willie. The higher-ups think you're becoming a liability." Willie laughed dryly. "A liability? I built half the operations they're sitting on. They should be thanking me, not gossiping like old ladies." Johnny's face softened. "You know it don't work like that. Loyalty only lasts until fear shows up." Willie looked out the window. Rain was falling again, soft and steady, like it always did when the world decided to remind him he wasn't in control anymore. "Fear," he repeated. "That's what it always comes down to, huh? Fear and silence." Johnny didn't answer. After a moment, Willie stood up, tossed a few dollars on the table, and said, "Come on, let's go for a drive." They drove aimlessly through the dark, the sound of the engine and the rain the only company between them. Willie stared out at the blurred lights of passing towns, each one glowing like a ghost of his past. "You ever think about how it all ends, Johnny?" he asked softly. Johnny frowned. "Don't talk like that." "I'm serious. You start off hungry, desperate, willing to do anything to prove yourself. Then one day you're the guy everyone fears. You start thinking maybe you made it, but you don't make it in this life, Johnny. You just last longer than most." The car was quiet for a long time. Then Johnny said, "You could go away for a while, Willie. Head down south, lay low. Maybe Florida." Willie smiled sadly. "I don't run, kid. Never did. If they're coming for me, they'll find me sitting right where I belong, at my table, coffee in hand, smiling like they ain't got the guts." That kind of talk made Johnny nervous. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You still got friends, Willie. You could talk to Frank again. Maybe he—" Willie cut him off. "Frank's done talking. He's playing diplomat, trying to hold what's left of the peace. I'm old news to him." He paused, then added, "You know what's funny? I spent my whole life making other men feel safe. Now I'm the one they're scared of." When Johnny dropped him off that night, Willie clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, kid. If it happens, it happens. You just make sure you're not sitting too close when the music stops." The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. He made breakfast, eggs, toast, a little bacon, and sat outside with his coffee. His wife came out in her robe, worried as always. "You're quiet today," she said softly. Willie smiled at her. "Just thinking." "About what?" He looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was struggling to break through gray clouds. "About how a man knows when his story's almost done." She frowned. but he just smiled and kissed her hand. "Don't worry, doll. I've had a good run." That afternoon, he got a phone call from an old acquaintance, Tony the Hat, the same man who'd come by weeks earlier with bad news. "Willie," Tony said over the phone, "let's grab lunch tomorrow. The boys want to talk. Maybe smooth things over." "Lunch, huh?" Willie said, a small smile forming. "Where at?" "Joe's Elbow Room, Clifton. You know the place." Willie chuckled softly. "Yeah, I know it." "Good," Tony said. "We'll keep it casual, just like the old days." When the call ended, Willie sat in silence for a while. He wasn't stupid. He'd been in this life long enough to recognize a setup when he heard one. The way Tony's voice tightened at the word lunch, the forced calm, the fact that it was Clifton, close enough to home but quiet enough for things to happen unnoticed. He thought about calling Frank Costello, maybe asking for one last favor, but he dismissed the idea almost instantly. No one could save him now. Besides, he didn't want saving. That night, he took out an old box from his closet. Inside were photographs, black and white shots from the early days. Him and Frank, laughing in suits that looked too big. A younger Lucchese grinning over a poker table. Sinatra standing beside him at a wedding holding a champagne glass. Willie chuckled softly, running a finger over the edges of the photos. "Look at us," he whispered. "Thought we were untouchable." He stayed up late that night, sitting in the dark with a glass of scotch, the radio playing softly in the background. Sinatra's voice again. "One for my baby, and one more for the road." The melody hit differently this time. Nostalgia, regret, acceptance, all wrapped in a single tune. When the clock hit midnight, he raised his glass to the empty room. "Here's to the boys," he said quietly, "and to going out like a man." The next day, he woke up early, put on his best suit, and combed his hair carefully. As he looked in the mirror, he smirked. Still got it. He kissed his wife on the cheek and told her not to wait for lunch. "I'll be home before dinner," he promised. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't be. He stepped outside, straightened his tie, and took one last look at his house, the place he'd built, the life he'd fought to keep. Then he climbed into his car and drove toward Clifton, humming Sinatra under his breath. He didn't know how it would end. Not exactly, but he knew one thing for certain. When it did, he'd face it standing tall, smiling, and unafraid. Because Willie Moretti had lived his life by one rule: never let them see you scared. And even as the shadows closed in, he wasn't about to start now. The air in Clifton that morning carried a strange stillness, like the world itself knew something was about to end. Willie Moretti drove with one hand on the wheel, the other tapping lightly on the dashboard to the rhythm of an old Sinatra tune humming through the radio. He looked sharp, navy suit, crisp white shirt, polished shoes. His gray hair was slicked back, and his gold watch glinted under the morning sun. He looked like the Willie of old, the man everyone once feared and admired in equal measure. But deep down, he knew. Every mile he drove toward Joe's Elbow Room felt like one more nail in the coffin of his story. Still, he wasn't nervous. There was a kind of peace in knowing your fate. After years of ducking bullets, dodging cops, and outsmarting rivals, the uncertainty was finally gone. He knew what this lunch was, a meeting dressed up like a goodbye, and he was fine with that. When he pulled up outside the restaurant, a couple of waiters were setting up the patio tables. They greeted him with hesitant smiles. Everyone in Clifton knew who Willie was, the man who once ran North Jersey like a king, who gave money to churches, helped families, and made sure no kid went hungry at Christmas. Even if he was a gangster, he was their gangster. He stepped inside Joe's Elbow Room. The place smelled of garlic, cigars, and thyme. He'd been there 1,000 times before, celebrating wins, cutting deals, laughing over plates of spaghetti and wine. But today it felt different, quieter. Tony the Hat was already there, sitting in a booth at the back with two other men, faces Willie recognized but hadn't seen in a while. Sal and Mikey, both from the old days. The moment he saw them, he caught the look in their eyes. Not hatred, not guilt, just discomfort. The kind that comes from knowing you're about to do something you wish you didn't have to. "Willie," Tony said, standing up with forced enthusiasm. "You look good, like the old days." Willie smiled. "Yeah, the old days. You mean when we didn't have to schedule our betrayals over lunch?" Tony froze. The other two looked away. "I'm kidding, boys," Willie said, laughing as he sat down. "Relax. You're making me nervous." A waiter brought coffee and water. The conversation started light. Talk about the Yankees, about politics, about how much things had changed. But the tension never left the table. After a few minutes, Tony leaned forward. "Willie, the commission's worried about you." "I figured," Willie said. "They think you've been talking too much. You know, with the feds asking questions about the boys in New York, about the rackets, about Vegas." Willie interrupted. "And who's saying that? I didn't say a word that wasn't already in the papers." Sal finally spoke. "Doesn't matter. The talk's out there. People are scared. They think you're getting unpredictable." "Unpredictable?" Willie smirked. "Because I told a few jokes at a hearing? Because I'm not hiding behind lawyers like the rest of you?" Tony sighed. "You know it's not about the jokes. It's about control. The bosses don't like feeling they can't control the story." Willie leaned back, sipping his coffee. Control. That's what it's always about. You ever notice that, Tony? Doesn't matter if it's money, power, or silence. Everyone's addicted to control. For a long moment, no one said anything. The sound of clinking dishes filled the silence. Then Willie looked around the table and said softly, "You boys don't have to do this. I know how it works. Orders come down, nobody questions it, but you don't have to be the ones sitting here." Tony's jaw tightened. "It's not like that, Willie." "Sure it is," Willie said. "You're following orders. I respect it, but let's skip the pretending." He reached for his napkin, dabbed his mouth, and smiled faintly. "You know something, Tony? I used to think this life was about loyalty, that if you stood by your word, your friends would stand by you. Turns out it's about fear. Always was." Tony looked down at the table. His hands were shaking slightly. Willie continued, "You can tell them I said that. You can even tell them I didn't hold a grudge, because I don't. I got no regrets. Not one." For a few moments, nobody moved. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Then Tony nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Willie. You always were." Willie smirked. "Good men don't last long in our business." He stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "Let's not drag this out. I'll take a walk." Tony looked up sharply. "Willie," but Willie was already heading toward the door. He paused just long enough to toss a few bills on the table. "Lunch is on me," he said with a grin. Outside, the afternoon sun had started to break through the clouds. The street was quiet, a few cars rolling by, a couple of kids on bikes in the distance. Willie took a deep breath, adjusted his cufflinks, and looked up at the sky. He thought about his childhood, the smell of his mother's cooking, the sound of church bells, the first time he held a roll of cash in his hand and realized he'd never be poor again. He thought about Frank Costello, about the nights they'd laughed and planned their empires over whiskey and cards, about how somewhere along the line the laughter stopped meaning anything. He thought about Sinatra, too, that kid with the golden voice and the nervous smile, the one Willie had once protected like family. "You owe me a song, Frankie," he murmured under his breath. "A real one." He smiled faintly, hands in his pockets, as he began walking toward his car. He could feel eyes on him, maybe from the restaurant, maybe from a car parked across the street. Didn't matter. He stopped for a moment, lit a cigarette, and looked around at the quiet town he'd once ruled. "Ain't so bad," he said softly. if this is how it ends. And then, in that instant, before the sound of tires screeched, before the quiet street erupted in a burst of noise, he exhaled one long, calm breath. No panic, no fear, just peace. Because even as the shadows closed in, Willie Moretti wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was facing it the only way he knew how. Head high, heart steady, and a smile on his face. After all, he'd lived his life like a man who knew every favor came with a price. And now, it was time to pay his own. Rain drizzled lightly over Clifton that night, washing the streets in a soft, silver glow. The neon lights from old diners and corner bars flickered against the puddles, reflecting a city that never truly slept, just sighed between the hours. Inside his modest house, Willie Moretti sat alone at the kitchen table, a cigarette burning slow between his fingers. The radio in the background played a Sinatra tune, "I'll Never Smile Again." And for a moment, Willie chuckled to himself. "How fitting," he muttered, exhaling a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. He'd gotten used to silence lately. The phone calls had slowed. The dinners, the poker nights, the friendly visit, all disappeared one by one. It wasn't hard to notice when the world started backing away. Men who once kissed his hand now avoided his gaze. He'd lived long enough to know what that meant. Still, Willie wasn't bitter. He'd had a good run. He'd made his fortune, helped his friends, and kept his enemies guessing. And truth be told, he was tired. The life he'd built, the empire of favors, fear, and whispered loyalties, it had become heavy to carry. He stubbed out the cigarette and poured himself a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid glowed in the dim light like a secret. He swirled it once and said quietly, "Here's to old friends, and the ones who forgot what that meant." Just then, the phone rang. The sound made him flinch, slightly, sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness. He reached for it slowly. "Yeah? Willie, it's me, Lou." The voice on the other end was shaky, nervous. "Lou who?" "Lou Ferry, from Newark. You remember, right? We used to—" "I remember," Willie interrupted. "You still owe me for that card game in 41. Lou chuckled weakly. "Yeah, about that. Listen, Willie, I just wanted to call and say, things are weird right now. Real weird. Guys are talking. They're saying stuff about you and about the commission. It don't sound good." Willie leaned back in his chair. "What kind of stuff?" "Stuff like you've been talking too much. That maybe you ain't all there anymore. They said you told the feds you'd sing if they pressed you." Willie's jaw tightened. "You believe that?" "Of course not, Willie. But you know how it goes. Once a rumor starts—" "Yeah," Willie said quietly. "It spreads faster than the truth ever could." There was a long silence on the line before Lou said, "I just thought you should know. Be careful who you trust, huh?" Willie smiled faintly. "Appreciate it, kid. But you don't get to my age by trusting anyone." He hung up the phone gently and stared at it for a long while. The words echoed in his head like a slow echo. Not all there anymore. That's what they thought of him now. A liability. A talker. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the rain-soaked streets. Once upon a time, every inch of this town had whispered his name. Now, it barely remembered. The next morning, Willie decided to take a drive. No destination, just a feeling. He got in his Cadillac and headed down the highway, the road stretching endlessly before him. He thought about the old days, when he and Frank Costello were building connections across New York and Jersey, when meetings were held in smoky back rooms, when loyalty meant something real. He remembered the night he first met Sinatra, back when the kid was still just a skinny dreamer from Hoboken, nervous about a gig. Willie had seen something in him. Not just talent, but hunger. He'd told the club owner, "Give the kid a chance, he's gonna make it." And he had. Sinatra never forgot that. For years, he'd send Willie Christmas gifts, call him from Hollywood, even dedicate songs when he played Jersey. But lately, even Frank had gone quiet. Maybe his people told him to. Maybe fame built walls where friendship used to be. By noon, Willie stopped at a diner he used to frequent, the Silver Spoon. The waitress, Maggie, recognized him instantly. "Mr. Moretti," she said with a smile that carried both warmth and pity. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Yeah, been laying low," Willie said, sliding into a booth. "Coffee, black, and a piece of that apple pie if you got it." She nodded, coming right up. As he waited, two men entered the diner. They were dressed too sharp for the weather, coats pressed, shoes polished. Willie noticed immediately the kind of men who didn't belong in a small-town diner unless they were looking for someone. Their eyes met his for a second before they turned and took a booth a few tables away. He didn't need to guess why they were there. He'd seen that look before. Cautious, rehearsed, the kind of stare you give a man whose time is running out. When Maggie brought his pie, he smiled and said, "Thanks, sweetheart. You always make the best slice in Jersey." She laughed. "You used to say that about every pie, Willie." He winked. "I lied to the others." The men in the other booth whispered something. One of them glanced toward the counter. Willie caught it. He didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly took a bite of his pie, chewed slowly, and said to Maggie, "Hey, doll, you ever think about moving out of Jersey?" She frowned. "Me? Why?" "Just curious. Sometimes you see too much of the same streets. You start forgetting there's a whole world out there." She tilted her head. "That's surprisingly deep coming from you, Mr. Moretti." He smiled, softly. "I had a lot of time to think lately." When he finished, he left a 20 on the table, more than enough to cover his bill. As he stood, one of the men from the other booth called out, "Willie, got a second?" He turned, face calm, eyes steady. "Sure. What's on your mind?" "Boss wants to see you. Says it's important." Willie nodded slowly. "All right, when?" "Tomorrow, noon, Joe's elbow room." He gave a dry laugh. "Of course. Always lunch, huh?" They didn't answer. They just nodded and left. Maggie looked at him, worry flickering across her face. "Everything okay, Willie?" He adjusted his jacket and smiled. Never better. But as he stepped outside and lit another cigarette, he knew exactly what this was. He could feel it in the way they spoke, the stiffness in their tone, the avoidance in their eyes. It wasn't a meeting. It was a goodbye. Still, as he stood in the drizzle, cigarette smoke curling around him, Willie Moretti wasn't afraid. He'd lived his life by one rule: never show fear, never beg, never run. If this was how it was going to end, then he'd face it like he faced everything else, with style, dignity, and that crooked little smile that once charmed both crooks and kings alike. He flicked his cigarette into the gutter, watched it hiss in the rain, and whispered to himself, "Well, kid, looks like the final curtain's coming down." Then he got in his car and drove off, the radio humming Sinatra once more. The same voice he'd helped rise to fame, now echoing his own fading story. The streets blurred into memory, and the man who once ruled North Jersey disappeared into the mist, heading toward a meeting he already knew the ending to. The following morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself knew what kind of day it was going to be. The clouds hung low over Clifton, the air damp and cold. Willie Moretti stood by the mirror in his bedroom, running a comb through his slicked-back hair. His reflection stared back at him, older now, softer around the edges, but still sharp where it counted. The suit he chose that morning was dark gray, pressed neatly, with a subtle pinstripe that caught the light. He adjusted his tie twice before deciding it was good enough. Beside him on the dresser lay his watch, a gold one, gifted to him by Frank Costello years ago. Engraved on the back were the words, "For a friend who never forgets." He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and smiled faintly. "Guess I never did forget," he muttered, fastening it to his wrist. Downstairs, the house was quiet. too quiet. The kind of silence that felt like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. He poured himself a cup of coffee, took a slow sip, and stared out the kitchen window. Across the street, kids were walking to school, mothers calling after them, cars honking lazily. Life was still happening, even as his own seemed to be winding down. At precisely 11, he grabbed his coat, slipped his gun into his inside pocket out of habit, and stepped outside. The autumn air bit at his face, but he didn't mind. It was the kind of cold that made him feel alive. He drove toward Joe's elbow room, the familiar streets rolling past like a film reel of his life. Diners where deals were made, alleys where whispers turned into fortunes, corners where he'd stood laughing with men who were now ghosts. Every turn of the wheel brought back a memory. He remembered the early days when the mob wasn't this complicated web of paranoia. Back then, loyalty meant something. A handshake could change lives. He and Frank Costello had built something out of nothing. Not just power, but an understanding. They kept things clean, controlled, reasonable. But now, the younger generation was different, hot-headed, reckless. They didn't understand subtlety, only ambition. They saw men like Willie as relics, too old-fashioned, too honest in their own crooked way. As he neared the restaurant, Willie slowed down. He could already see the black sedan parked outside, two men sitting in it pretending to read newspapers. He almost laughed. They don't even try to hide it anymore. Inside Joe's elbow room, the smell of garlic and coffee filled the air. It was quiet for lunchtime, only a few regulars scattered around. The owner, Joe himself, gave Willie a nervous smile when he walked in. "Morning, Willie," Joe said softly. "Coffee?" "Sure, kid. Why not?" Willie took his usual booth near the back, the one with the good view of the door. Joe poured his cup and left without another word, the clink of the spoon on porcelain sounding too loud in the silence. Minutes passed. Then two men entered. Suits. Cold eyes. The same pair from the diner the day before. They nodded at him politely before sitting across from him. "Morning, Willie," one of them said. "Morning," Willie replied, stirring his coffee. "You boys look like you didn't sleep much." The man forced a smile. "Long night. You know how it is." "I do," Willie said, leaning back. "So, what's the story? You said the boss wanted to see me." The other man hesitated. "Change of plans. He couldn't make it. Sent us instead." Willie took a slow sip, never breaking eye contact. "That so? And here I was thinking we'd get to share a plate of linguine like the old days." "Things are complicated," the first man said. "They always are," Willie muttered. "Go on. Say what you came to say." There was a long pause before the younger one spoke. "There's been talk, Willie. The bosses, they think maybe you've been saying too much. Not on purpose, but..." Willie set his cup down gently. "You think I'm losing it." "No one said that. You didn't have to." The two men shifted uncomfortably. The older of the two sighed. "Look, Willie, you know how it is. The life, it's not personal, it's business. And the higher-ups, they're nervous. With all the attention lately, with the papers, the hearings." "Business," Willie repeated quietly, cutting him off. "That's what we tell ourselves, huh? Every time it's a friend, every time it's someone who's been there from the start, we just call it business. Makes it easier to swallow." Neither of them spoke. Willie smiled faintly. "You know, I used to sit at this same booth 20 years ago. Different crowd then. We laughed, we made deals, we respected each other. Now I sit here with two kids who look at me like I'm already gone." The older one swallowed hard. "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that," Willie said. His tone wasn't angry, just tired. "So, what happens now?" There was another silence. The younger man reached into his coat pocket, but Willie raised a hand. "Don't bother, kid. Not here. Joe's a nice guy. Doesn't need to clean up after your mess." The man froze, unsure whether to continue. Willie finished his coffee, set the cup down carefully, and stood. "Tell your boss I appreciate the courtesy. You can tell him I knew this was coming, and I ain't mad. Everyone's got their part to play." He adjusted his coat, straightened his tie, and looked both men in the eyes. "But remember something. Once upon a time, men like me made it possible for you to even sit at this table. Don't forget that." Then he turned and walked out, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. Outside, the afternoon had grown colder. The wind carried the scent of rain, the sky heavy and dark. He walked slowly to his car, each step deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. Inside the Cadillac, he sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the street. People were laughing, cars passing, the world still spinning as if nothing was happening. He thought about calling someone, maybe Frank, maybe even Sinatra. But what was there to say? Some things didn't need words. Instead, he whispered to himself, "Guess this is it, huh? The last ride." He started the car, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled away from the curb. The rain began to fall again, soft at first, then heavier. As the windshield wipers swept rhythmically, Willie felt oddly calm. He'd made peace with his fate long before today. He had lived a life larger than most men could dream of, filled with danger, laughter, betrayal, and loyalty. But above all, he'd lived by his own rules. And as the rain blurred the world outside, he smiled faintly and whispered, "At least I played it my way." The Cadillac rolled down the long road out of town, its taillights glowing red against the stormy sky, fading slowly into the gray distance. A fitting exit for a man who once lit up every room he entered. The rain hadn't stopped by the time Willie reached the outskirts of town. It came down in silver sheets, steady and relentless, smudging the world into soft outlines. The Cadillac's wipers kept time with the soft jazz playing on the radio, a tune from another era, something mellow and bittersweet, like the sound of memory itself. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just driving. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the rain felt like company, the kind that didn't demand conversation. Willie had always liked the road. It gave him time to think. And today, that's all he wanted. To think, to remember. He drove past old haunts, the bakery on Bloomfield where he'd once loaned a struggling owner $500 and told him to pay it back when business was good. The man had never forgotten. Every Christmas, he still sent Willie a box of cannoli. Then there was Tony's barber shop, where he used to sit for hours, gossiping and listening to Sinatra records while pretending to read the paper. Those were simpler days. But now the world had changed. The men had changed. And Willie, despite his charm and jokes and easy smile, was a relic in their eyes. The new generation didn't value subtlety or restraint. They valued power and noise. They wanted everything fast: money, respect, fear. He took a slow drag from his cigarette and exhaled toward the windshield. "They don't make 'em like they used to," he muttered. As the miles rolled by, his thoughts wandered back to Frank Costello. They hadn't spoken in months. Costello was under pressure too. Everyone was. The heat was on from Washington, with hearings, indictments, and cameras flashing in men's faces who had lived most of their lives in the shadows. It wasn't a good time to be visible. Willie wondered if Frank knew what was coming for him, if he knew the whispers that had started, the ones about mental slips and talking too much. It was strange, almost poetic, that after a lifetime of keeping secrets, he might be undone by words he never even said. He pulled over near an old riverside park, a place he used to take his wife and daughter on Sundays before the business took over everything. The river was swollen with rain, moving fast and dark under the bridge. He sat there, engine idling, watching the water rush by. He thought about all the things he'd lost along the way. His wife, who couldn't handle the long nights and unexplained absences. His daughter, who moved out west to escape the shadow of his name. Even his friends, one by one, gone to prison, exile, or worse. And yet, sitting there in the car, he didn't feel regret. Not really. Maybe a kind of sadness, but not for himself, for what the life had become. Once it had been about loyalty and survival. Now it was just about paranoia and control. He turned off the radio and the silence hit him harder than expected. The only sound left was the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Then his thoughts drifted to the kid, the one he'd met years ago at the club in Newark, trembling before his first performance. Frank Sinatra. Willie smiled at the memory. He could still hear that voice, nervous but powerful, singing like the world might end if he stopped. He'd told the club owner that night, "This kid's gonna be something." And he was right. Sinatra had never forgotten him either. Whenever Willie called, Frank answered. Whenever he was in Jersey, he stopped by. It wasn't about business between them. It was friendship, pure and rare. Willie wondered if the kid ever thought about him now, in his Hollywood mansions, surrounded by a different kind of crowd. Maybe he did. Maybe he'd hear one day that Willie was gone and pour himself a drink in quiet remembrance. That thought made him smile. "Yeah," he said softly. "The kid'll remember." A car slowed down on the other side of the road. A black sedan. It didn't stop, just rolled by, headlights cutting through the rain. Willie watched it go. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was another pair of eyes keeping tabs on him. Either way, it didn't matter. He started the car again and turned back toward town. He had an idea. A stop he wanted to make before the day was over. There was a church in Montclair, an old stone building with a cracked bell tower, and a priest who had known Willie since he was a teenager. Father Dominic. The man had baptized him, married him, and heard his confessions back when Willie still believed forgiveness could be earned. When Willie entered the church, the place was empty, except for the flicker of candles and the faint smell of incense. He walked down the aisle slowly, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Father Dominic appeared from a side door, his hair now white, but his eyes still kind. "Willie," he said softly, "it's been a long time." "Yeah, Father," Willie replied. "Too long." They sat in the front pew together. The priest didn't ask why he'd come. He didn't need to. Men like Willie only showed up when the weight of life had become too heavy. "I don't know where to start," Willie said finally. "Then start with the truth," the priest said gently. Willie chuckled. "You sure you're ready for that?" Father Dominic smiled faintly. "I've heard it all, my son." So Willie talked about the choices he'd made, the people he'd hurt, the good he tried to do where he could, about loyalty, betrayal, and the strange loneliness of power. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The priest just listened, nodding slowly. When Willie finished, there was a long silence. The rain tapped against the stained glass like soft applause. "Do you believe God forgives men like me, Father?" Willie asked finally. "I believe God sees the heart," Father Dominic replied. "And I believe yours, despite everything, still wants peace." Willie sighed deeply. "Peace. Yeah, that'd be nice." The priest put a hand on his shoulder. "Then go and find it. However you can." Willie stood, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He thanked the priest, slipped an envelope of money into the church donation box, and stepped back out into the rain. As he walked to his car, he felt something strange, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity, maybe even acceptance. He knew what awaited him. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He got in the car, turned the key, and whispered, "Guess I'll find my peace soon enough." The rain eased up as he drove off, leaving behind the quiet church, the flickering candles, and a man who had finally unburdened his soul. In the distance, thunder rolled softly, like applause fading into the night. The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The streets of Jersey were washed clean, the air fresh with that after-rain scent that made the world feel briefly new. But for Willie Moretti, the dawn didn't bring peace. It brought a strange, uneasy calm, the kind that always came before a storm. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee that had gone cold. His house was quiet, too quiet. The phone hadn't rung since last night. No jokes from the boys, no calls from Frank, not even a word from his driver. Just silence and that faint hum of electricity in the walls. In front of him lay a folded newspaper. The headline wasn't about him, not yet, but it might as well have been. Senate committee calls new round of witnesses. Beneath it was a photo of a man he knew well, someone who'd sat beside him at dinners and laughed at his jokes, now looking pale and small under the harsh flash of cameras. Willie rubbed a hand over his face. "Poor guy," he murmured. "They'll eat him alive." He understood what was coming. The country was changing, the world was changing, and there was no more room for men like him. The walls were closing in, not with guns or fists this time, but with microphones and subpoenas. Still, he wasn't the type to hide. That had never been Willie's way. He believed in facing whatever came, smiling if he could. Dying, he thought, wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a man. Living afraid, that was worse. He drove into town, not because he had business to handle, but because he wanted to see it all again. The diners, the storefronts, the sidewalks where he'd once been greeted with nods and, "Good morning, Mr. Moretti." The people still smiled at him, still waved, but there was something different in their eyes now. A flicker of worry, a question, a quiet wondering if maybe the stories were true. At the corner cafe, the owner, Louis, poured him a cup without asking. "Morning, Willie. You want the usual?" Willie smiled faintly. "Yeah, and make it quick before I change my mind." Louis laughed, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You okay? You've been looking, I don't know, tired lately?" "Tired," Willie repeated. "Yeah, that's one way to put it." He sipped his coffee slowly, taking in the sound of forks clinking and the smell of butter and toast. For a brief second, he let himself imagine it was still 20 years ago, before the headlines, before the hearings, before the whispers that turned friends into strangers. Then the door opened, and 3 men walked in. They weren't regulars. Too quiet, too sharp. Suits a little too dark, eyes that didn't blink enough. Willie noticed right away, of course. A man like him didn't survive this long without learning to read a room. They didn't look at him directly, but they didn't need to. Their presence was enough. Louis noticed too. His hands trembled just slightly as he wiped the counter. Willie put down his cup, left a bill under the saucer, and stood. "Thanks, Louis," he said, patting the man on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself, huh?" Louis nodded quickly. "You too, Willie." He stepped outside into the sun, adjusting his hat against the glare. The air was warm now, but he could still feel that chill, something in his bones that told him the end was near. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. He drove out toward Fort Lee, to a quiet overlook where you could see the river and the skyline beyond. He'd always liked this spot. It reminded him of how big the world was, how small even the toughest man could seem when faced with it. As he leaned on the guardrail, a memory came to him. His first real job, decades ago. Collecting from a bookmaker who'd refused to pay. He'd been nervous, too nervous to eat that morning, but when he walked into that man's shop and smiled, everything had fallen into place. That was the day he learned charm could do more than fists ever could. That was the day he realized he could talk his way into or out of anything. He chuckled softly. "Guess the charm's not going to get me out of this one." Behind him, a car door shut. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He could feel it, the stillness, the way the air seemed to hold its breath. "You fellas pick a nice day for a drive," he said quietly, his eyes still on the water. No answer, just footsteps. 3 sets, slow and measured, the sound of gravel under polished shoes. He turned then, smiling that same easy smile he'd worn for years. "So what's the story, boys? We going for a ride, or is this where the tour ends?" Still silence. The one in the middle, taller than the rest, reached into his coat. Willie watched him with calm, steady eyes. No fear, no anger, just acceptance. He thought of Sinatra, of that first night in Newark, of Father Dominic's words in the church, of his wife's laughter, his daughter's small hand in his. He thought of all the people who'd crossed his path, some helped, some hurt, and the strange winding road that had brought him here. He straightened his tie. "Tell Frankie I said no hard feelings," he said softly. The men hesitated as if surprised by his calm. Willie gave them that grin again, the one that could light up a room, even now. "Come on, boys, let's not drag this out." And for one brief, surreal moment, time seemed to freeze. The sound of distant cars, the shimmer of sunlight on the river, the cry of a gull overhead, the world, holding still, waiting. Then it moved again. Hours later, the river carried on as if nothing had happened. The wind rustled the trees, and the city lights flickered to life across the water. Somewhere, a radio played an old Sinatra song, soft and haunting. And though his name would fade from headlines and the world would move on, there were those who'd remember Willie Moretti, not as a villain, not as a saint, but as a man who lived life on his own terms, smiled at the end, and never once looked away. Night had fallen heavy over New Jersey, the kind of night where even the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual. The rain had come back, soft and persistent, drumming gently against the awnings and the hoods of cars parked along the curb. Willie Moretti sat alone in his study, the curtains drawn, the faint smell of cigar smoke hanging in the air like a ghost of old habits. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but there was something about this silence that unsettled him. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was more like knowing the end of a long song was near, and you could already hear the last note echoing in your mind before it was played. The phone on his desk sat there black and still. It had been ringing less and less these days. The people who used to call him for advice, for jokes, for protection, they were staying quiet now, and silence in his world was never a good sign. He reached for a bottle of bourbon, poured a small glass, and sat back, staring at the smoke swirling in front of him. "Funny thing about time," he muttered, half to himself. "You don't notice it slipping until the whole deck's reshuffled." He'd been around long enough to see the old rules crumble. Men he once respected were either gone or pretending to be invisible. There was no honor anymore, just ambition and fear tangled together. Even the faces he'd known since the old days seemed harder now, colder, and the whispers about him, those had grown louder. Word on the street was that Willie was losing it, that his mind wasn't sharp anymore, that maybe he'd say something he shouldn't. The Senate hearings had everyone paranoid. One wrong word, one slip, and men's lives could unravel faster than a cigarette burns. But Willie hadn't changed. The world around him had. He still believed in keeping your word, in shaking hands and meaning it. He still thought loyalty was something sacred. The young bloods coming up didn't see it that way. To them, loyalty was a trick you played until it stopped paying. He took a slow sip, the burn of the bourbon settling in his chest. His reflection in the window looked older than he remembered, lines deeper, eyes a little duller, but still carrying that trace of mischief that had always defined him. "Maybe they're right," he murmured, smiling faintly. "Maybe I am losing it." A knock at the door broke the quiet. 3 soft taps. Willie didn't flinch. He set the glass down and called out, "Yeah, come in." The door opened just enough for a familiar face to peek through. Tommy, 3 Toes Ricci, one of the few he still trusted. A wiry man in his 40s with tired eyes and a nervous twitch, Tommy stepped in and closed the door behind him. "Evening, boss," he said, his voice low. "Mind if I sit?" "Go ahead," Willie replied. "You look like you got something on your mind." Tommy hesitated, then sat opposite him. His hands were fidgeting, his knee bouncing slightly under the desk. It's getting bad out there, Will. Real bad. People talking. People you don't want talking. Willie leaned back, folding his hands on his stomach. Let 'em talk, they always do. Tommy shook his head. Nah, this ain't like before. It's different this time. They're saying you're, not all there. That maybe you'll go up there and say something you can't take back. Willie's smile faded. You mean testify? Tommy looked down. That's the word, yeah. The room went quiet again except for the steady patter of rain outside. Willie let out a soft sigh, then chuckled. I've been hearing that same story for months now. First from strangers, then from friends. Now from you. Tommy's voice cracked slightly. I ain't saying I believe it, boss. I think maybe you should lay low a while. Take a trip. Florida, maybe. Just till this blows over. Blows over? Willie repeated with a grin. Kid, nothing ever blows over in this business. It just changes shape. He stood up slowly, walking to the window, looking out at the glistening street below. The city looked beautiful in the rain, soft and distant. It made him think of his early days. Nickel bets, speakeasies, laughter echoing through back rooms. A time when the risks were smaller, and so were the lies. He turned back to Tommy. You know what the problem is, kid? These fellas running things now, they forgot that this life isn't about money or fear. It's about respect. Without it, you're just another crook with a suit. Tommy swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. I just don't want to see anything happen to you, boss. Willie smiled. Something's got to happen to all of us, kid. That's life. The trick is making sure when it does, you're facing it with your eyes open. He clapped Tommy on the shoulder. Go home. Get some rest. Don't worry about me. Tommy hesitated, then nodded slowly. If you say so. When the door closed, Willie sat back down and exhaled deeply. The loneliness pressed heavier now. He thought about the people he'd outlived, the friends, the enemies, the ones who'd disappeared quietly. He'd always imagined he'd go out with a laugh, not a whisper. The clock ticked steadily. Midnight. He stood, grabbed his coat, and headed outside. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, but the world still shimmered with that wet glow only a few could appreciate. He drove aimlessly through the streets of Jersey, passing old haunts and corner bars that had once been filled with life. He stopped outside one, a place that had been theirs once, back when things were simpler. Inside, the jukebox was still playing faint old tunes. The bartender recognized him immediately, his eyes widening a bit. Mr. Moretti, he said softly. Willie nodded. You still serving? Always. He took a stool at the far end, away from the crowd, ordered one drink, then another. People looked his way, whispering, but he didn't mind. Let them. After a while, someone approached. A man in his early 30s, slick hair, sharp suit, nervous smile. Mr. Moretti, I just wanted to say, it's an honor.